Hello, welcome everyone to this first session on corporate purpose. I would like to stress as well the provocative nature of discussing corporate purpose. It's a topic that forces us to discuss very fundamental questions about the nature of the corporation to as well very practical ones of how we make purpose useful and valuable to corporations, if at all. So we have first Professor Colin Meyer from Oxford, who will be presenting his paper, Our Corporate Purpose Statements, Verbiage, and he will be presenting for 25 minutes. And then we will have Professor Luigi Zingales from Chicago booth, who will be discussing this paper for 15 minutes, probably with his signature provocative insights, I hope so. And then we will close with 15 minutes of Q&A. So please use, during the session, there is an icon at the bottom that says Q&A. So please send me your questions so that I can gather them and engage at the end on a conversation both with Colin and with Luigi. So thank you very much. Colin, the floor is yours. You have 25 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mireia. So the subject, as Geordie said, of this conference is, can purpose deliver better corporate governance? And my answer to that question is going to be yes. And the subject of this particular session is, can our corporate purpose statements verbiage? And my answer to that is also going to be yes. So I'll then try and explain how one reconciles those two assertions. And let me start by just giving the definition of verbiage from the font of the English language, namely the Oxford English Dictionary, which says it comes from the French verbiage, sounds better already, and that it's superabundant or superfluous wording, profusion of words without good cause or without helping to make the intended meaning clearer or more precise, excessive wordiness or elaborateness of language. And in fact, I think that purpose statements are somewhat more than that. They're not only verbiage, they are what one might describe as being twaddle. And the Oxford English Dictionary definition of twaddle is senseless, silly, or trifling talk or writing, empty verbosity, dull and trashy statements or discourse, empty commonplace, prosy nonsense. So in explaining why I think that purpose statements in many cases lie somewhere between twaddle and verbiage, I'm going to do it in the context of discussing the various theories that have been put forward as alternatives to the underlying paradigm that currently prevails, namely the Friedman doctrine, that there is one and only one social purpose of business, to increase profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And the four that I'm going to be looking at are, first of all, enlightened shareholder value, stakeholder theory, shareholder welfare, and corporate purpose. So let's start with enlightened shareholder value. So enlightened shareholder value is the notion that in pursuing shareholder value, companies should take account of the interests of other stakeholders, because by taking account of the interests of other stakeholders, that might increase shareholder value, at least under certain circumstances, it does so. And this became very popular during the 1980s when Edward Freeman put it forward, and it became adopted in some 28 states in the United States in the form of the constituency statutes, of which one example is the case of Minnesota, which was enacted in 1991. Enlightened shareholder value is quite well summarized in terms of the Companies Act in the UK, which states that a director of a company must act in the way he considers in good faith would be most likely to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, which is basically a shareholder primacy statement. But then it goes on and says, and in doing so, have regard amongst other matters to the likely consequences of any decision in the long term and the interests of and its impact on its other stakeholders, namely its employees, its suppliers, customers, communities, the environment, the company's reputation, and its members. Now, what then enlightened shareholder value is really saying is that in terms of promoting shareholder value, companies should have a broader cross-sectional interest in terms of their other stakeholders, a longitudinal interest in the long-term performance, and they should promote the interests of stakeholders insofar as this enhances the value of the company over the long run. Now, the issue that this raises is that, in essence, it's an instrumental view of the promotion of stakeholder interest. It's an extrinsic concept by which the interest of other stakeholders are taken into consideration insofar as they promote shareholder value. And that means that companies should, for example, pay their employees fair wages. They should look after the suppliers in their supply chains. They should promote the environment. They should produce safe and healthy products, and they should pay their fair share of taxes, so long as that increases shareholder value. Or to put it another way, they should pay as little in the way of wages to their employees. They should employ people in their supply chains in as cheap conditions as possible. They should produce addictive products. They should undermine the environment. They should avoid paying taxes, so long as they don't break the law and in so doing harm their reputations to such an extent that they undermine the value of their companies. Now, that might be enlightened, but it's not enlightenment in which it was certainly thought of during the age of the Enlightenment. And furthermore, it doesn't provide any protection of companies that are pursuing those enlightened notions against an activist or a hostile acquisition coming along seeking to cut wages to its employees or to reduce the amount of taxes they're paying, and thereby increasing the value of the company. The stakeholder theory notion instead says that companies should have an intrinsic interest in their other stakeholders and should promote that interest in other stakeholders alongside that of their shareholders, and should do so both in the short and the long term. So the case of the Minnesota constituency statute that was introduced in 1991 is an illustration of that. And it says that a director may, in considering the best interests of the corporation, consider the interests of the corporation's employees, customers, suppliers, and creditors, the economy of the state and nation, community and societal considerations, and the long-term as well as short-term interests of the corporation and its shareholders, including the possibility that these interests might be best served by the continuing independence of the corporation. Now, if you want to have a definition of verbiage, you probably don't have to go much further than that. And furthermore, what it's really trying to do is to say that companies have this obligation of, to all stakeholders, that it should uphold in an intrinsic sense, and it should promote them together with the long-term and short-term shareholder interests. It is, in other words, not just verbiage, it's in essence an impossible management task to expect companies to be promoting all those interests. It gives rise to very weak corporate governance on the grounds that accountability to everyone is accountability to no one. It's very difficult to measure performance against all of those stakeholder interests. It produces confused incentives. And notice that that Minnesota statement was around the notion of may, not must. So it's permissive, it's not prescriptive. May is essentially mush in this regard. Must may mean more than may does, but in essence, that isn't the basis really for expecting companies to promote that level of generality of stakeholder interest. So neither enlightened shareholder value nor stakeholder theory are themselves very compelling arguments. So we come on to the third one, which is shareholder welfare, which has been put forward by my discussant Luigi. So in a nutshell, it is simply excellent. And the reason why it's appealing is that it focuses not on all stakeholder interests, but that of shareholders. And it notices that shareholders are indeed humans. And as humans, at least they are at present, it may be the case with artificial intelligence, as that accelerates, increasingly investors will be replaced by humans will be replaced by machines, but at present they're humans who've got an interest in their environment, in their societies, in their health, in the quality of the products that they consume, in an interest in their children and in their grandchildren. In other words, that they've got an interest in their welfare as well as their wealth. And so what Luigi and his co-author Oliver Hart says, it is too narrow to identify shareholder welfare with market value. The ultimate shareholders of a company, in the case of institutional investors, those who invest in the institutions, are ordinary people who in their daily lives are concerned about money, but not just about money. They have ethical and social concerns. So what they're arguing is that, first of all, one should retain focus on shareholder interests, but recognizing that those interests extend to societal and environmental considerations, and therefore the fiduciary responsibilities of duties of companies and institutions to their beneficiaries should be to the welfare, not just to the wealth of those investors. And underpinning this is the notion that the Friedman doctrine errs in terms of two assumptions. The first is in relation to the assumption it makes about the separation that can be made between philanthropy and the commercial activities of companies, and secondly, the reliance that it places on regulation to constrain the activities of companies. And Luigi and Oliver note that that supposed separation has very undesirable properties. So, for example, the robber barons, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts engaged in rape and pillage and then sought redemption for what they did in terms of setting up foundations and giving away the fortunes that they'd accumulated. It would have been much more efficient if they hadn't engaged in that rape and pillage in the first place. Regulation is very difficult to prescribe a lot of the elements associated with welfare, for example, in terms of what might be an important consideration of employees' dignity, and that in particular in an increasingly international world, which is regulated largely on a national basis, as companies become more global, it becomes increasingly impractical for regulation to be able to constrain their activities. Now notice, this does focus on a broad range of factors that companies have to take into consideration then in looking at the welfare of their investors. And a way in which they suggest this can be done is through the use of mutual funds, which not only have a diversity in terms of financial risks and horizons in the traditional sense between small and high cap, large cap companies, but also in terms of the focus of the mutual funds on welfare considerations. Now, the issue that this raises is, well, to what extent would those mutual funds be in practice able to actually implement this notion of shareholder welfare? And in a more recent paper, they look at the notion of exit versus voice, where exit might come from consumers in terms of boycotting products, or from investors in terms of divestment. And they, I think, quite convincingly argue that neither of those are likely to be effective, because in essence, you're just going to shift from having socially responsible consumers and investors to less socially responsible ones. Engagement, on the other hand, they believe can be effective. I don't perhaps place quite so much faith in engagement as they do. There are a number of assumptions underlying their model, for example, in relation to all shareholders being pivotal shareholders, whereas in fact, as Luigi, for example, recorded in a paper in the 1990s, the proportion of pivotal shareholders even then was less than 50% and has probably become even less since then with diversification by shareholders and internationalization of portfolios. There's also a problem about the extent to which investment chains dilute the ability of even welfare promoting investors at the head of the chain to be able to pierce through the funds, the asset owners, the fund managers, to influence what goes on at the level of the firm. There are also questions about the extent to which activism and takeovers might deflect companies from pursuit of purpose, but more significantly, it's important to note that this is still an extrinsic notion of interest, of welfare interest. That is to say that companies should take account of the interests of stakeholders to the extent that it reflects the interests of shareholders. And the fact that these things can quite seriously diverge is illustrated by the fact that if you take the case of family companies, which are in many cases the most widely observed forms of ownership, families are found to be highly regarded by their employees and to look after their employees. But when it comes to broader social and environmental considerations, then they're often found to underperform. That is illustrated, for example, in the case of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family and the opioid epidemic to which OxyContin has given rise, and in the case of the environment in the VW Dieselgate case, as illustrations of the fact that companies where even there are pivotal shareholders and no investment chains, and there's a potential interest in welfare on the part of the families, that can still conflict quite seriously with stakeholders' intrinsic interests. So if we come to corporate purpose, then the issue around the definition of purpose centers around what people understand by the notion of corporate purpose. Corporate purpose is generally regarded as being why a business exists, is created, and its reason for being. And if you put it in those terms, then it's not surprising that those purpose statements come out as being verbiage. It's a bit like asking the question that we're often asked as children as to what would you like to be when you grow up, to which the only real sensible answer is bigger. And that has quite a close analogy with these issues around purpose, where people, if they're looking for a one-word answer, are looking for better rather than bigger. But if one brings greater specificity to the notion of purpose, then it provides a basis on which one can move away from the verbiage statements to something that really makes sense. And if, in particular, if one regards purpose as being about providing profitable solutions to the problems that you and I face, then it really begins to pin down those notions of purpose. So the idea of purpose, which is being advocated, is the notion that it's about finding ways of solving the problems that you and I, as individuals, as societies, and the natural world face, and to do so in forms that are profitable and not to profit from producing problems for either people or planet. Now that brings clarity to the notion of corporate purpose, and that clarity brings credibility. And in particular, what is key to corporate purpose is not just the clarity around corporate purpose statements, but the enacting of that purpose in companies. And in that regard, it's interesting to observe that there's a second paragraph to that UK Companies Act, which says that companies can substitute the notion of purpose for the idea that they should promote the success of the company for the benefit of their members, and therefore that it could read that they should promote the purpose of the company, and in so doing have regard to the interests of all those other parties as well. Now, that's one element in terms of the implementation of corporate purpose, and law is clearly critically important in terms of defining the duties of directors, but the other elements are in relation to regulation, the rules and enforcement of regulation, ownership, the rights and responsibilities, governance in terms of the appointment, alignment, and accountability of the boards of companies with promoting the interests of their investors and their purpose, the measurement in terms of metrics, accounting and valuation, performance as measured by profits and the implication that has for incentives in organization, finance, the funding and stewardship of companies, and investment in terms of resource allocation. Now, the way in which those elements are currently thought about is that law is about the duties of directors to shareholders, regulation is about the rules of the game and their enforcement, ownership is about the rights of shareholders, governance about the resolution of the agency problem of aligning managerial interests with those of their shareholders, measurement is about measuring financial and material assets, performance is about profits, finance is about responsibility to investors, and investment about maximizing shareholder value. But if one thinks about it in terms of purpose, what one's looking for is firstly that law should be about defining the duties to deliver the company's purpose along the lines of exactly what I was describing in relation to the UK Companies Act. It's also a feature of the Loire Pact that's been put forward in France and of the Public Benefit Corporation in the United States. Regulation is about not just the rules of the game, but aligning purpose with social licenses to operate. Ownership is not just about the rights of shareholders, but the responsibilities of shareholders, in particular in promoting the purpose of companies. And the example of family companies to which I've just been referring is an illustration of the way in which owners can and do feel a sense of responsibility. Governance is then not just about accountability for interests in relation to shareholders, but accountability for delivering the purpose of the company. Measurement is about measurement, metrics, and counting and valuation in relation to purpose. Performance should be measured in relation to purpose and have that feature of not profiting from producing detriments for other stakeholders. And finance in this context is about the funding and stewardship of purpose, as is reflected, for example, in the way in which there has been a stewardship code that's being put forward to promote the idea that investors have a role, not only in terms of promoting the interests of their beneficiaries, their investors, but in terms of stewarding the companies in which they're investing. And investment itself by companies is something that needs to be done in partnership with the others that are needed to deliver on those purposes. Now, the implications of this is that it brings validity to the notion of purpose in the sense that it's not something that is imposed by a purpose police. Any purpose is desirable insofar as it's Pareto improving if it doesn't give rise to profiting at the expense of other parties. It encourages a plurality of purpose, a clarity of purpose, and an innovation in its delivery in terms of finding ways of solving those problems in profitable fashions. The way in which one should be evaluating the performance of companies should be through extending existing standards and measurement to incorporate those elements that are relevant to the delivery of purpose. And what this does is to promote financial and operational resilience in companies insofar as they are promoting those purposes in a way that benefits and does not create detriments to other parties. The issues it raises is in terms of the extent to which a better understanding of purpose will really bring clarity to those notions of purpose, the extent to which there is going to be precision in those metrics measurements, the importance of accountability and governance being really reflected in the way in which oversight of companies operates in relation to the delivery of their purpose. And it's significant to note that in relation to the sort of investor interests that Luigi was talking about in terms of promoting broader shareholder welfare, then this in essence is a mechanism by which the costs of finance of companies that pursue purposes is diminished. So let me then just conclude by bringing together the relationship between these concepts so that one can see how, in essence, they can come together. So if one combines the notion of enlightened shareholder value with that of the notion of shareholder welfare, then what one is looking for is the notion that a director of a company is pursuing the success of the company for the welfare of its shareholders, and in so doing have regard to the likely consequences on the long term and the welfare of its stakeholders. In other words, it's about promoting the interests of the welfare of its stakeholders to promote the welfare of its shareholders. The notion of enlightened stakeholder welfare is about promoting the success of the company for the welfare of all its stakeholders and having a view of the long term in the process of doing that. Now, what the notion of shareholder welfare in the context of corporate purpose then gives rise to is much greater clarity about what precisely the company should be doing in terms of promoting shareholder welfare, namely by solving problems of other parties, of people and planet, and not doing so from producing problems for either. So in essence, what it's saying is that promoting shareholder welfare is in essence derivative of what the company should be doing in terms of promoting the solution to those problems. It brings clarity to the stakeholder notion by defining which stakeholders the company interests it's promoting and in what way it's trying to solve their problems. It brings effective governance and accountability because it's a governance to shareholders, but it provides a legal lock-in of those corporate purposes that also protect those corporate purposes going forward. It promotes fair competition and diversity of purpose because it encourages companies to pursue purposes that have a broad objective in terms of the solution to those problems. And in the process of promoting shareholder welfare, it thereby creates a lower cost of capital for companies that deliver on those corporate purposes. Now, in conclusion then, what I think emerges is from this comparison that the notion of stakeholder theory is in essence unworkable and impractical. Enlightened shareholder value provides a minimum standard of what might be deemed to be acceptable. The notion of corporate purpose and the reason why so many purpose statements are verbiage is that basically that reflects the vagueness around which purpose is currently being thought about, and those verbiage statements are filling the void of that vagueness. If, on the other hand, one brings precision to purpose by defining it around the notion of addressing problems of particular groups in society, then one can bring purpose to be reflected in corporate purpose, in corporate practice, and to be embedded in the way in which companies behave. And that should be supported by public policies and corporate laws that encourage companies to promote their corporate purposes. In the process of doing that, one thereby helps to achieve that reduction of cost of capital that comes from a recognition that shareholders have an interest in their welfare, not just in their wealth. And let me just finally conclude by giving an illustration of this, which I think demonstrates that it's not just in relation to the UK Companies Act, or indeed in terms of the Loire Pact, or the Public Benefit Corporation, but another example comes from Denmark, where the industrial foundation laws have given rise to the development of a large body of some of the most significant and successful companies in Europe, companies like Bosch, Bertelsmann, IKEA, Velux, that all have as their owners industrial foundations. Now, those foundations, in essence, provide that lock-in of the corporate purpose to which I was just describing. They provide the accountability and oversight of what the boards are doing in terms of delivery of those purposes. They ensure that the cultures of those organizations are aligned with the delivery of that purpose. And what one observes in terms of their financial performance is that their financial performance is much in line with that of equivalent other companies, matched companies, but they are differentiated in one regard, and that is that they survive much longer. If you look at companies that survive for at least 40 years, then of the industrial foundations, around 30% of them survive for that length of time, whereas if you look at a match sample of companies, only around 10%, a third of the industrial foundation numbers survive for that length of time, which brings out that point about the resilience of the notion of purpose in terms of promoting the success of companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. I will pass now the floor to Luigi for his discussion.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for this great opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper and discussion by Colin. I have to say, I'm reacting to the paper he sent me, which of course is very related to the presentation he made. The presentation is broader, integrates other aspects. So I will, on the fly, try to adjust that, but I apologize if it's just on the fly. So I think that what Colin is about in this paper, and also in part in the presentation, is about sort of a very important aspect, which is trying to, a very ambitious goal, try to reinvent capitalism. And so, of course, this is a tall order for everybody, but it's a high task for everybody, even for somebody as smart as Colin Meyer. Now, there are 3 points I agree with Colin completely. So the first one is that the corporate governance system is really crucial in shaping the capitalist system. I think that we don't spend enough time thinking about this. Capitalism, since the beginning of the 20th century, has been corporate capitalism, and is very much shaped by the largest corporations. So the way these corporations are run really shapes the flavor of the capitalism that we have. And I will not dwell too much into this, because I actually have a podcast dedicated to this, to what is working in capitalism, what isn't. It's called Capital Isn't. So I refer to that for people who are interested. The second is that Colin makes it very clear that Friedman's doctrine is outdated. And as many of you know, Pro-Market, which is a publication of the Stigler Center, hosted a debate on the Friedman statement 50 years later. And I refer to that debate. Colin participated. There are a lot of enlightened people who participate in that debate. And I think that if you want to get my sense of the conclusion, you can find them there. The third point, which is probably the most important, is that people are not motivated only by money, and that purpose is a very important motivating factor. Colin uses the intrinsic motivation language. I think that's an important language, particularly as millennial and Generation Z are joining the workforce. I think that having a purpose that is bigger than just making money is an important factor. And we need to deal with that at a corporate level. Now, in spite of this agreement, I find discussing this paper difficult. And why is it difficult? Because I think faced with the problem of today's capitalism, and I think that there are many, and I am the first one to recognize, Colin responds with what I consider a beautiful mantra, that is, companies should produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, not profit from producing problems for people or planet. Now, this is beautiful in many dimensions. The alliteration and pronounced with a Colin British accent sounds even better. Now, the question I have is this a moral precept for the individuals, a managerial guide on how to improve companies and the way they're run, or a policy prescription for corporation? And my impression from reading the paper, my impression also for listening to discussion, is a little bit of all of the three. So I think it's important to distinguish which one do we believe and how do we behave accordingly. So as a moral precept, I'm sorry to say, Colin, but I do prefer Kant. I think as a philosopher was better than you. Moral categorical imperative of Kant is, now Kant was probably less good at phrasing sentences in a way that is popular these days. So every time I read this, I have to read it 3 times to understand. The bottom line of this categorical imperative maxim is that you should behave in a way that if everybody behave the same way, you're happy with. So it's kind of a general equilibrium idea of your precepts, and I think that is a very good one if you can have people to follow. Now, most people don't follow them, but that's a different story. And why is it better? It doesn't require the definition of profitable. I come back on that. And also definition of what is problems of people and planet. And this is basically just a general equilibrium consistency argument that as economists, we understand very well. Now, is this a managerial guide? As economists, we tend to look at trade-offs along a production possibility frontier. We are obsessed with trade-offs. Now, managerial scholars study how to move that frontier. And I think that that's very important. Maybe we should spend more time doing that. And after all, the piece I'm discussing is coming out in managerial science. So maybe that's the goal. And Colin is arguing that his approach moves the frontier, which might well be true. And he say that this is a way to maximize first value, maybe even introducing externality. Now, if that's the case, my question is why entrepreneurs and VCs don't choose it? Maybe it's just that they have not read Colin's writing yet, and once they will read it, they will converge, and then we'll go in that direction. As Colin said, in the past, the choice might have been limited, but today, in most places in the world, including the United States, there is a possibility of public benefit corporation. So if I am an entrepreneur and I want to set up a company with a purpose, I can opt for a public benefit corporation. And when you look at the statistics, very, very, very few entrepreneurs do it. And the question is why? And actually, I talked to one, a company that is pursuing an explicit social goal is still preferred to go with the traditional form of corporation. And in his view, is because of the cost of capital, but I will come back on that. So as a managerial guide, I think as a possibility, but I think that remain to be seen its validity. The third is a policy prescription. And if it's a policy prescription, we need to ask 3 things. So why is this limited just to corporation? Number 2, how feasible this is. And number 3, what are the implicit risks of an approach like this? So let's start with the corporation. Now, Colin is very much aware that corporations do enjoy what I like to call an exorbitant privilege, borrowing from the macro literature, which is the limited liability vis-a-vis tort claimants. Why? Because Colin and I can organize a company in which we have limited liability vis-a-vis everybody, but unless we incorporate, we don't have limited liability vis-a-vis the tort claimants. That's a privilege that is granted by the sovereign to the corporation. So if Colin's focus was on the type of externality that affect tort claimants, his conclusion would make perfect sense. So if you're saying, I'm afraid that companies dump too much toxic waste in the river because they don't face enough tort liability because of this limited liability, as a result, we put some restriction, that would be perfectly logical. Now, my interpretation, and I'm happy to be wrong, my interpretation is Colin's concern about things like global warming, inequality, races, stuff that does not necessarily lead to tort liability. And so I don't think that that's an issue. And if you want to mandate social purpose to fix these problems, why do you want to mandate it only for the corporate forms? If I have a limited partnership, should I sort of be exempted from all this? And to what extent people are migrated to limited partnership to avoid this? So let's now go to point number 2, which is it feasible? And here I would like to bring an example of a company that is famous for its social purpose. So Craigslist is very much dedicated. Craig, the founder of Craigslist, is very much dedicated to the public good. In fact, it has a foundation, so it's the typical company that Colin loves, as a foundation that has as a goal promoting trustworthy journalism, protecting voting rights, everything that Colin likes. And I do that too, by the way. Now, interestingly, there is a recent paper that shows that Craigslist, in its business, actually did exactly the opposite of what they wanted. So most people think that the journalism was killed by Google and Facebook. The reality is journalism was killed by Craigslist, because by taking away the advertising revenues of the classified ads, they really destroy local journalism. And in fact, this paper documents that when Craigslist enter in a market, what you see in that market, you see a reduction in newspaper circulation, you see cut in the number of journalists, you see a change in the content, less politics, especially local. You see fewer people going to vote because they are not informed. You see politicians becoming more extreme. You see everything negative, basically. And so the question is Craigslist producing profitable solutions, or is profiting from producing problems? If I look at this paper, I would say is profiting from producing problems. If I look at the structure, I would say the opposite. So I think that that's an important distinction. And in general, how can we tell the difference? Now, most importantly, I'm concerned about a risk of mandating a corporate purpose. So Colin in his paper defines capitalism, at least the traditional capitalism, the one he wants to reform, as being an economic system of private ownership of the means of production and its operation for profit. I actually think differently. For me, the essential element of capitalism is freedom of enterprise. So you can lease the means of production, doesn't really make a difference. You can organize the way you want. In fact, both Colin and I work for a non-profit organization called University, but they are private organization. They are not owned by the state. So I think that to me, the essence of capitalism is freedom of enterprise. And freedom of enterprise means also freedom of incorporation. Now, by introducing a mandatory social purpose, the concern I have is that there must be somebody screening that purpose. And who is that? And who is that to decide what is social and what is not? During the fascist era, the savings and loan in Italy that were organized as basically public benefit corporation considered the social purpose donating to the young fascist organization. Today, we don't think that that's a good social purpose, but that's very dangerous, especially the more powerful a state is, the more restricts alternatives form of competition. So I think that this sentence is used very often and abused very often, but I do think that if we kill the freedom of enterprise, we end capitalism as we know it. Now, at the end, Colin had an example, and his example was mostly about Danish company, probably has learned over the number of times he presented this to avoid the name Novodisk. That is one of the primary example he brings in his paper and in his speeches. Now, Novodisk is a pharmaceutical company that is a triopoly that controls 96% of the insulin market. And it uses this market power to increase the prices dramatically. So between 2001 and 2017, the prices of insulin in the United States has increased 671%. The price of another type of insulin, 724%. So they're using this in a massive way. And a recent study looks at what is the difference between the price of the product and the price of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, if you put them together. And here there is an example of two types of insulin. The estimates for the price, I think, is per kilo, is $6.5. In the US, sells for $48.2, and another one, 6.5, and sell for 34.20. So is Novodisk cross-subsidizing customers in developing countries from pricing in developed countries, as Colin seems to suggest? Or is simply price discriminate to maximize its profits, and then it's selling corporate responsibility as an excuse? Is doing what is called greenwashing. Now, suppose that is cross-subsidizing, as Colin claims in his paper. Whose objective function is it maximizing? And this is something that governments, if they want, can do very well, and we see donation done all the time by government. So who is Novodisk to decide that poor Midwestern farmer in the United States should subsidize rich African in Nigeria, because there are also rich African in Nigeria, by pricing the very low in one place and very high in the other? Why should we buy this corporate socialist that looks like a la Robin Hood? It's basically steal where you want, and this is stealing because I think price collusion is tantamount to stealing, and you would distribute at your wish. Now, I want to end with a warning, because many of these corporate purposes get a lot of enthusiasm from the corporate sector. And my warning comes from nothing short than Adam Smith. And in The Wealth of Nature, he said, the proposal of any new law, which come from businessmen, ought always to be listened with great precaution, and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined. And why? Because those guys have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both been deceived and oppressed. So I think that we should stick to Adam Smith's warning and beware of corporate bearing gifts, not only Greeks bearing gifts, but also corporate bearing gifts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luigi, for this fantastic discussion. Colin, would you like to respond?
Yes, I'll just quickly respond, and thank you very much, Luigi, for that discussion. I think the points that you're making really can be summed up in terms of your belief that the notion of purpose is infeasible, it's not being practiced, it gives rise to serious distortions, and it undermines freedom of enterprise. Now, that is exactly the converse of what I think people understand by what purpose is doing and what it should be doing. And in particular, you start off by raising a question: is it a moral statement? There is some moral element to it. So in particular, the notion of not profiting from producing problems is essentially the equivalent of a Kantian law, a categorical imperative notion as to what one would will to be a feature of companies in general. The observation that companies are not incorporating as public benefit corporations, well, actually, amongst the smaller companies, there has been quite a take-up of public benefit corporations, but the area where one really wants to see that happening is in relation to large corporations. And there, as you'll be aware, there's a serious problem that if you try and shift, and you can only do so with a supermajority of your existing shareholders, then actually getting the ability to be able to shift where it's not a must as against a may is extremely difficult to do. The notion that it's in essence a policy prescription that is only being applied to certain types of organizations is exactly the opposite of what's being suggested. It's that the notion of the purpose should indeed apply to other organizations such as limited partnerships. And indeed, it's something that one can think about in the context of public corporations as well as private corporations. So it's in no way trying to be exclusive. The idea that it's in some respects contrary to freedom of enterprise, as I was saying in my presentation, that is exactly the opposite of what it's actually doing. It's promoting greater plurality and variety of companies. It's saying that the purpose of companies should not simply be to maximize shareholder wealth, and you're in essence putting that forward when you're talking about shareholder welfare as well. You should have diversity in terms of form, and it doesn't require, that's the whole point, it doesn't require someone to have to come along and determine what is an acceptable or an unacceptable. If it's the case that those purposes are profitable and profits are defined in terms of not producing problems for either, then this is in essence Pareto improving. And you don't have to have someone selecting what should or should not be a purposeful company. In regard to Novo Nordisk, the point that I'm making in relation to Novo Nordisk is precisely that the cross-subsidy is not the right way of trying to address the problems. And that's why, and the bit that I emphasize in terms of Novo Nordisk is, it is looking to find ways of solving the problem of diabetes that doesn't involve taking insulin at all, okay? So really the impressive element about it is that it's seeking to find alternative treatments, and it is seeking to find ways in which one can change people's lifestyles in such a way that you don't have to engage in cross subsidies. And the sorts of problems that have arisen in relation to the pricing in the US are a reflection of exactly why one doesn't want to go along a cross subsidy line in terms of trying to solve that problem. So in essence, what the way in which you're interpreting purpose is quite contrary to the notion of what that purpose can achieve. And the idea that this is something that should be simply resisted because companies are apparently promoting it is quite at variance with the notion that what one should be doing is to try and encourage them to promote purposes that have real substance to them, and not to use it as a means of essentially deflecting from other forms of regulation that might be imposed upon them. So,
no, sorry, Colin. Well, I would like to, with respect to this last point, Colin, because there have been so many questions from the floor that I would like to introduce at least 2 or 3, so that you can address them. And the first one refers to this plurality that you are mentioning, when it says that if there are different variables that concur to create corporate purpose, how can we decide which weight is given to each of the variables? And to avoid manipulation of such a concept. So I think that we all have this concern about if it's too plural and we are just there is no hierarchy here of how we should go about it.
The way in which that is addressed is in terms of the way in which you then measure the corporate purpose and the extent to which that measurement establishes the benefits that are conferred, the extent to which those benefits have a value that's attached to them, and the sorts of metrics that are being developed are designed to do exactly that, to identify where purpose can most profitably be focused in terms of the contribution that it can make to solving problems, and then creating an accounting system that accounts for the true profit, a profit that does not come at the expense of others. So a key part of the actual process of implementation is in terms of the measurement system.
Luigi, go ahead as well. You can respond to before we end this session. We have just 1 more minute, so Luigi, you will have the final call here.
I want to be clear because maybe I wasn't clear. I love the idea of a privately implemented purpose. So that's the reason why I say choose which one. If this is a managerial sort of a guide, I think is great. Let 1,000 flower blossom and see which one is better. Where I am nervous is when I read the report of the British Academy that says that companies have to have a corporate purpose, because if you force them to have them, then the risk is somebody has to decide what is a good purpose and what is not a good purpose, and then we get in trouble, like the example of Craigslist. So I'm all in favor for variety. I'm all in favor for intrinsic motivation. I'm all in favor for trying different form of organization and see which one is best.
Thank you very much, Colin and Luigi, for your interventions, and thank you to all participants. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.